What's up, everyone? Roy here, and you're listening to the Clemens with a Z podcast. I got another episode here for you in the We Were in a Cult series here on the podcast. And I was able to talk to Rachel, who is a former Kingdom Kid in the ICOC, and she shared her personal story in the church and out of the church. We were able to explore topics such as the toxic diet culture in the church, gender issues, and also the unique challenges of being an elder's kid. I was really grateful to connect with her, to have her story added to this growing conversation of all of us trying to process and figure out this wild thing that we were all in. So enjoy, and thank you all for listening. All right, we're live. Hey, Rachel.
Hey Roy, how you doing?
I am great. Thank you so much for doing this, for being here on the podcast, adding to the conversation
Yeah.
that we're having about this wild thing that all of us were in.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Glad to get to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I'll jump right in. We'll just jump right into this. So, how'd you get involved with the ICOC?
Um, Through my family, my parents had been kind of in and around some of the campus ministry movements that were like precursors to the ICOC in like the 70s. And when I was growing up, there was a period of time where we were attending like mainline churches of Christ. And my parents have both spoken about this to hundreds, if not thousands of people. So I'm not saying anything that other people haven't heard before, but they just felt like they weren't getting the kind of spiritual support they wanted or needed in the mainline churches of Christ. And so at the time, we were not living anywhere with an ICOC church. So my dad like flew to another city and did the Bible studies. And when he was ready to get baptized, like me and my mom and my brother like went to see him get baptized. I was probably in kindergarten when that happened, or maybe like the year before kindergarten, somewhere in that age. Um,
Mhm.
and then we moved to a city that had an ICOC church. And my mom decided that she needed to do the studies and get baptized. And so that was for sure when I was in first grade. And so ever since first grade, up until I left the church, my family was part of the church.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
So we'll call you a Kingdom Kid. How about
yeah,
that? You
I
were,
think that applies.
yeah.
I barely
So,
remember in a time in my life, my childhood where we
Mhm.
weren't part of the church. Yeah.
Yeah. That term mainline Church of Christ is always something, people don't understand
Yeah.
like what that means. To us it's such normal jargon, the
Yeah.
mainline Church of Christ, and yeah, I would tell people like, yeah, the church was called the International Church of Christ. Like, oh, so you're a Church of Christ? And I'm like, no, we're not denominational. It just like doesn't make sense to
Yeah.
people that we have Church of Christ, but we consider ourselves non-denominational. And so, for those of you that don't, the mainline Church of Christ is basically the denomination of Christianity, the churches of Christ. And then we were the offshoot of that.
Yeah. Yes. An offshoot of that's how I would usually describe it, just to say, well, we're like a modern day offshoot of the Church of Christ. And like the
Mhm.
mainline Church of Christ was founded in like the early 19th century. uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And when I've done my small amount of study on the Church of Christ, to me, like I want specifically like the Stone Campbell movement.
Yeah.
When I read the books about it and I'm looking into it, it just sounds so much like what Kip and we were doing.
Yeah.
It's so many parallels, it's like
Yeah.
these guys that were like, this is how we should be and this is how it should go. And I mean it was popular. It
Oh,
gained
yeah.
fire. Hmm.
My understanding about the Stone Campbell movement, um, hello, listeners. I'm a U.S. history professor, so bear with
That
me.
focused that focused on early religious movements, pre-Civil War. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, good.
Uh, Yeah. Yeah, it's part of their idea was like, we're going to simplify Christianity. We're going to find like the key doctrines that everyone can agree on. And then like people will see that we're right and that we've got
Mhm.
the correct doctrines. And then we'll like solve all the infighting in Protestantism. And people will like flock to us because we'll have it all figured out.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that that is not exactly how that that went down, right?
No. Nope.
They didn't ultimately diminish the infighting in Protestant Christianity, although they did found their own movement. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, my whole uh side of the family and my mom's side are all Church of Christ, so
Yeah.
it's
My,
still around.
it is still around. My dad grew up in the mainline Church of Christ. My
Hmm.
mom, I think, grew up Presbyterian.
And,
Um, yeah,
and the biggest thing that I always like, they didn't believe in music in services,
right.
which was the biggest thing because I remember I had family members come to our church and we loved the music.
Yeah.
We had the choir and all that stuff, and I remember it was very hard for them to sit through the service.
Yeah. I think it was instrumental music specifically,
Hmm.
right? Because like Church of Christ would sing, but it had to be a cappella, right?
Oh
No,
yeah. Hmm.
no guitars, no pianos.
Oh
At this point, it's been so long that I forget what specific scripture they used to justify that particular
yeah.
variation. But
I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole,
so
but
many. We'll
but
rein ourselves in.
yeah. So if you were like your parents members of the church, your dad was Church of Christ, your mom's Presbyterian. Um, do you- what was your view of God as a kid?
Yeah, I've heard you ask other listeners about this, and I've thought about it some in the past week or so. And like, I don't know, I think when I was really little, my view of God was probably positive.
Hmm.
Um, I was thinking like, how did I think about God when I was little? And I think, I mean, to a certain extent, I don't know that I thought about it that much. It was just sort of some like God is there and something I took for granted. But, in like preschool and early elementary school, like most of what you learn about God, at least what I learned about God was like, God is love and like Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world.
Yeah.
Um,
Isn't that
so
a
God is
song?
like, yes, it is. And Jesus loves the
Of the
little children.
little children.
That
All
that
the
one.
gosh, okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry.
We're gonna start a jam band.
We will. Uh-huh. So did it change? Did your view of God change as you got older?
Yeah. I think I couldn't tell you at what age it started, but I'm a somewhat anxious person. And I think
Hmm.
it's kind of a chicken and egg situation where it's like, was I naturally anxious? And then, like, the teachings of the church just made that worse? Or would I have been kind of chill and the teachings of the church gave me anxiety? I don't know. um, but when you get a little bit older and you start, at least this was my experience when I was getting a bit older, kind of like approaching middle school, so ages 10, 11 in that area. I started to be really worried about like sin and that I was doing something wrong and that I needed to like find the right way to live. um I when I was in like fifth or sixth grade, I had a whiteboard in my bedroom and I made this like really detailed schedule for myself that I would get up like 2 hours before elementary school started or before middle school started. And I would have my quiet time and I would do this and I would do that.
Hmm.
So I was definitely, um, a focused child.
Was that unprompted? Like you were just like, I need to do this?
It was, I mean, other than the fact that we were being taught about quiet times and how important it is to start your day with God. And, my parents would do the same, but nobody was like, Rachel, you should take a whiteboard and, at the age of 10 or 11,
Hmm.
make a quiet time schedule for yourself.
Yeah. Sin was definitely on the forefront of a lot of the conversations in our
Yeah.
church, and I could see why that would make you anxious. Man, I can't believe that you did it in fourth or fifth grade. Jeez.
Yeah.
Good
My
for you though.
my parents are very organized people, so I'm sure that's some of that's,
Hmm.
it's like my dad used to have 2-day planners, for example. Um,
Really?
that was like around the same time. So maybe there was a little bit of that like seeping
Jeez.
into me. Yeah.
There there are heaps of day planners that I've tried to keep in my 40 something years here. They're just a mountain of day planners. I don't know how people do it.
Yeah, I just have a spiral notebook that I just keep like a running to-do list.
Yeah.
Because I have like according to my therapist, I have something called demand avoidance. So
Uh-huh.
if I feel like I have to do something, then it's the last thing I want to do. So I sometimes just have to like ride the wave of like, I can't do this task today. What else can I do? So I just have like the list of tasks.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
you know, so whiteboard Rachel is a thing of the past. We'll just say
Mhm.
but yeah, I think I started to be very focused on the idea that like God was very concerned with what I was doing and was most likely disappointed. Like most likely was disappointed with me. Yeah.
That tracks. Yeah, I don't know if I've ever felt that God truly thought I was doing okay, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I don't have an embodied memory of feeling like God loved me. When
Yeah.
you asked
Hmm.
me that question, I was like, I can kind of intellectually think back to, ages like 5, 6, 7. And I don't have any specific memories of feeling like God didn't love me or feeling anxious about God at that time. But like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, I don't feel in my body a time that I can remember, oh, God loves me. Yeah.
Yeah, that tracks. That tracks with a lot of us. Um, it's interesting how like we have this religion that it's like the first thing we think about is that the creator of everything is disappointed in us.
Yeah.
You know? Like that's like step one. Basically, you've already screwed up. So let's spend the
Yeah.
rest of your life trying to make up for that, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so like so you're in the church. What were some positive things? Like how did it feel as a kid in the beginning being a part of this?
I mean, I think some of the positives for me, when I was still in like elementary school and junior high age, is that like wherever we went as a family, there were friends to be made. Um,
Mm,
my father is a retired surgeon, and when I was growing up, we moved quite a few times, a few different cities before we ended up in the place where I went to junior high and high school. So the church definitely provided like kind of instant and immediate community and friends.
mhm.
Um, and so that was really cool. Um, as I got older into my teen years and beyond, I think two things that stand out to me as being positive. One, I was always involved in like the music ministry and I love to sing. And so that was fun to me that like getting to sing every Sunday, whether it was from the congregation or on the stage. I always enjoyed that. Everyone in my family does music as well. So like it's very dorky, but we would do like family quartets sometimes. Because my mom and I could trade places on alto and soprano, and my brother sang bass, and my dad could kind of squeak out the tenor part. So, the music was great. Um,
I think my dad wished that we could have all done that. He was incredibly musical.
oh
He
yeah.
would probably have lost his mind if we could do a family quartet.
I mean, I mean, we still sometimes, when we're all four of us together, we still sometimes trot out the old quartet music, just
Oh
because
my gosh.
we all have a lot of fun with it. So, the music, the community, um, and something I feel like was a positive for me as a person. I don't know if I appreciated it at the time, but as an adult looking back, I really appreciated that the church tried very hard to be like interracial, multi-ethnic, and even like bringing together people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Personally, I'm like a white woman from kind of a middle to upper middle class background. And I think it could have been very easy for me to grow up, especially if I had just kind of stayed within my like suburban high school environment, not to know or interact with in a deep and meaningful way, people who had like different life experiences from mine.
Mhm.
Um, so, I don't think that I really thought about it at the time because it was just my reality, but now as an adult, I have some real appreciation for that. Um,
Do you think that that shifted, or not shifted, but shaped your reality in more of like a positive way to be exposed to different cultures and classes of people?
Absolutely. One thing that I've always appreciated about my parents, and I think this is part of why they were drawn to the ICOC from like a positive perspective, is that they're people who are very curious about other cultures.
Mhm.
And so I would say for me um, that also created like a kind of curiosity and an openness as well.
Mhm.
Um, and like now I'm an educator, and I think part of my job is to continue to educate myself, but then also to be aware of the fact that my students, I work at like a big public university. So like my students come from a variety of backgrounds. And I think, that helps me to be kind and compassionate with them. And it just makes life more interesting, when you're, when
Mhm.
you're, when your default setting towards people who are different from you is like, oh, cool, I want to know about you, right? Like, I don't know. I think that makes life more interesting.
Yeah, I think it's lacking in society in a lot of ways. We kind of stick to our little pockets of people and things like the neighborhoods that we're in. It can feel
Yeah.
very like, I'm gonna use a big word, homogeneous.
Yeah.
There you go. Um, but yeah, like there's a lot like our church. Like I remember like as a kid, I'd go to my grandparents' church and it's in middle of nowhere, Tennessee, and it's all white. But then I go to our church and like it's everybody.
Yeah.
I think as I was trying to like, I remember the Bible talk my parents used to lead. There was a family from Africa, a family from Czechoslovakia. There were multiple people of color, and there was one guy who he had one leg and like one arm,
Hmm.
and like, but like that it just made, to me, I think what it did is it made people that are different, it just wasn't weird. Like I
Right.
knew that like I'm not the only, like the world is bigger than me. I guess that's what I got out of that, because we had
Yeah.
talked about this a little bit earlier. That was one of the things I got, because I was constantly being around people that didn't look like me.
Yeah.
So, and then it also brought up, a lot of curiosity, as you were saying. And I don't know, not to take over, but I think it also, like, I was just exposed to so many positive examples of people of color
Yeah.
that, like, that does something to you, to kids,
Yeah.
like that representation and seeing, a person of color like being nurturing to you or kind or opening their home or like anything like that. And it was, I mean, I think I'm really grateful to have had that as well.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about, you and I are about the same age, like early 40s. And if you think about like some of the representation we saw of people of color, like on the news, in popular
Hmm.
culture, like, like what was like one of the most popular movies in the 1990s was like Dangerous Minds. Do you remember that movie?
Yeah. Or Boys in the Hood.
Yeah, like, or like the OJ trial or what, like
Yeah. Hmm.
all of these kinds of things. And, you know, that could have been as, as a, again, as like a middle class white person, that could have been my primary understanding of our exposure to like people of color. But because we went to the church we went to, it wasn't. And, it sounds awful to say, but like had a lot of friends who were different from me. I don't mean that in like a facile, like I have black friends, quote unquote,
Yeah.
that white people say, but like,
Hmm.
in that community, we had lots of different friends from, white, black, Asian, etc.,
Hmm.
Latin American. And I think that, yeah, was really positive. Um, I've said that was really positive about 10 times, but I mean it.
It's okay. Yeah, it just it's like because if you are only around people like you and you're exposed to like the things in the media or on TV, I mean, you're gonna frame anybody who's different like in that way,
Right,
you
exactly.
know? And I think that exposure at a young age, I think benefits because if you think about like if you're 25 and never seen a person of color, when you interact with them, it's like, what? And then it's like, wait, the world's not like me and my family. Like
Yeah.
it's just it's incredibly like it can be damaging and shocking. And some people don't recover from stuff like that. And then they retreat back to their little,
Mhm.
area. So yeah, I think it was really awesome to think about to be exposed to that and to be around that and but also to see like if your parent like it sounds like your parents were curious like my parents were the same way. This is just how you are with people. This is how you are. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. Come on in, let's hang out. We'll get to know you.
Totally.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously biased because that's how I was raised, but I think that's a good way to be in the world. Like
Hmm.
to have a default stance of like curiosity and openness and like wanting to have compassion for other people,
Hmm.
those are those types of things I think are, I mean, they are still my values, even if I'm quite far away from the church context. Those are things that I still aspire toward.
Yeah, because it's we're very like we think we're huge with regards to like America, but because it feels that way, right?
Yeah.
It feels because this is just where we are, but like there's this whole big world out there.
Yeah.
We're just a small part of it.
Yeah.
I think it doesn't diminish my worth or value. I think if anything, it just broadens, okay, yeah, this
Yeah.
it's there's a big world out there and that's okay, you know? It's not
Yeah.
something to be feared or to, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Um, and it keeps things in perspective too.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So I'm assuming that you ended up wanting to be baptized.
I did. Yes.
What was the motivation? Was it because God was disappointed in you and you wanted to, you know?
Let's see if I could end that feeling.
Yeah.
Okay. So my story with baptism is that I did the studies and I was baptized twice. Um,
Why were you baptized twice?
well, the first time I did the studies, I was 11.
You were
Um,
11?
11. So to be honest with you, I kind of don't remember exactly what it was at age 11 like what specific thought processes or circumstances prompted me at that point, that was 30 years ago. Um, I mean, I told you the whiteboard story. So like
Yeah.
I was the type of kid who talked to adults really well. I seemed very mature for my age. I was very bookish. I was quiet. And so I think there must have been a part of me that, wanted to do it because that's what my family did. That's what our community did. But also I was very much like a people pleasing, adult pleasing type of kid. So I think there must have also been a part of me at that age that was like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And not to say that it wasn't genuine, but I was 11. So, like
Mm-hmm.
you're still very much a child when you're 11. Um,
Surprised they
so
let you, right? I'm surprised that yeah.
it was unusual. And I think it was honestly just because I had like, I don't want to toot my own horn, but like the intelligence and the
Oh,
apparent maturity to be able to say the things and to like grasp what I was supposed to be able to say and what I was supposed to be able to do.
gotcha. Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to say that that was false, but just that like I was young and this is what I thought I was supposed to do. And I was able to kind of do it in a way that was persuasive to the adults in my life that I knew what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then when I was 14, my grandfather passed away, my mom's father. And for me, that was, the first really significant death in my life. And so I remember this phase a little bit better, but I went through this period of like questioning God and being upset and not being sure that I really wanted to do this whole God thing anymore. Um, and so after going through a period of several months, maybe about half a year of kind of like questioning God, um, I came to the conclusion that, the only reason I could have had these doubts and the only reason I was off on this kind of temporary path of, I'm going to say quote unquote rebellion because I didn't do anything rebellious. I still followed all the rules and I still went to church 16 times a week and, whatever. I just, in my mind, was rebelling against the situation.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I decided that my baptism must not have been genuine, and I didn't really understand what I was doing at age 11. So I decided to do the studies again, because I wanted to like have a real baptism. And people people took my word for it. Um,
Wow. Mm-hmm.
and to be fair to me, there was a precedent of getting a second baptism in my family because my dad had grown up, like I said, mainline Church of Christ, and he had been baptized in his teens. And then he got baptized again in his late 20s because he decided that his original baptism must not have been real. And then my mom had been baptized
Yeah.
in the
Uh-huh.
campus ministry. And then
Mm-hmm.
when she joined the ICOC, like she ended up getting baptized again. And so there was this kind of precedent of like, well, maybe you can have a false baptism. And I actually almost did the studies again in college and almost, and then I talked myself off the edge and I was like, there's only so many times you can have a false baptism, right? Like you don't have to do the studies and get baptized again every 3 to 5 years. Like that's not,
I
uh,
think that like I've been to a bunch of churches and I have yet to hear about something like this, like outside of our little church.
the idea that
Because
you need to get baptized again, you mean?
like, yeah, the baptism that matters is the baptism at our church.
Yes.
And
Yes.
like the fact that like it could be fake. Like it didn't matter because you didn't do the light and dark study and when you got baptized first in your other church, so you need to do this. You need to do
Yeah.
it our way for it to matter.
Right.
And it's like you can't just like join the church and be like, all right, yeah, you're here, great, glad to have you, you know,
Yeah.
let's hang out. It's like, okay, wait a second there, man or
Yeah.
woman. Like, you were Presbyterian, well, of course we have to rebaptize you, or like this.
Totally. Well, I mean, it's got to be adult water immersive baptism,
Yep.
and you must say your good confession, uh,
Hmm.
or it's not genuine.
It's
That's
not.
um
And let's hope to God that you don't have a toe or a knee or an elbow out of the water when you get baptized, or then you're going to have to redo it again.
what were you baptized in? Do you remember? Like
I
what?
was baptized in a shell of like a spa, so maybe like the shell of like a hot tub
Okay,
that they
yeah.
would wheel into the hotel and then fill it with water, and then you would get baptized there. And then it
Yep.
wasn't until maybe it was after mine, but they had to have one of the engineering guys figure out how much water to actually put in the baptistry because I'm not overflowing. That was embarrassing and terrible. But yeah. So anyway.
I was baptized in swimming pools both times.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
See, that would have been fine. Like, you come around
Yeah.
here, a lot of churches here at the beach, you get baptized in the beach.
Yeah.
That seems cool,
My
you know?
mom was baptized in the Pacific Ocean, which was totally rad. My
Uh-huh.
dad was baptized in a horse trough in a basement.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I've seen people that like get pushed down in those big, big, giant like barrels.
Yeah.
Mhm. I wish my baptism was like in like a flowing river in the
Yeah.
woods, like at like at dawn, as the sun coming up.
That's very
That
poetic.
that would be a rad baptism.
Yeah,
So after your second baptism, you got it right and everything was great, right?
totally. And I
What
had
was
no
it?
further problems.
No further problems. What was it like after that, like in the teen years and stuff like that?
Yeah, like a lot of positives, but also some challenges. Um, I think I've probably made it clear that I'm kind of a thinker,
Mhm.
like so and I was at that age, like already as a teenager, I was someone who was just thinking about things all the time. Um, and so even though there were a lot of positives, I still enjoyed the friends I had at church, the music, kind of the general sense of community. I remember that I started having some doubts about the church, even, at ages like 15, 16, um, because of friendships that I had with people who were not in the church, which, as you and others on the podcast have
Uh-oh.
mentioned, was something
Uh-oh.
I shouldn't have been doing.
Oh, you don't want to be yoked with an unbeliever. Oh, wait, that was used for marriage. Never mind. Wrong one.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Definitely don't want to be yoked with an unbeliever, but
Yeah.
um I I always was the sort of person who made friends. Like I always had friends outside the church and inside the church. But when you get to be a teenager, I think that starts to matter a lot, like who your friends are, what your social connections are, who do you sit with in the lunchroom, blah, blah, blah. Like it's so
Yeah.
important at that age. And I made a best friend. We met in the seventh grade and we had our quote unquote define the relationship talk in the eighth grade where we declared we were best friends. Um,
Define the relationship. It's not how
and
I thought that was going to go.
no,
Sorry.
no, I'm being a little cheeky.
It's fine.
We
Yeah.
there was no romantic thing between me and her, and we're still very close. Like she's still one of my very best friends. Um, her parents did not raise her in church at all. And
Wow.
yeah, like she just was raised without church. And then when she was in high school, she joined the Unitarian Church, um, which,
Interesting.
you know, um, you know what the ICOC would say about Unitarians. Like, like if they thought Baptists were out of line, like,
Oh gosh, yeah.
Unitarian.
How did you get away with having a Unitarian friend that didn't go to church?
Well, she was a very good person, and
Uh-huh.
we took a lot of the same classes. We got into no trouble together. Like our hangouts would be like, let's go to the mall or let's have a sleepover and make cookies. So, there was like nothing for my parents to object to really in terms of like, you couldn't
Yeah.
have called her a bad influence.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't remember that I did this, but she has told me, and I believe her 100%. But like every summer, I would go to church camp and I would come back from church camp all, quote unquote, convicted of how I was a sinner and not doing what I was supposed to do and not following Jesus. And I would like call her on the phone crying and being like, I'm not trying to bring you to Jesus and I'm terrible. And, like, like, I should be trying to save your soul. And she said
Yeah.
to just where she would expect that this would come. And she was like, you'd do it once a year and then you'd settle down again and it was fine. Um, so
What a great friend.
she's amazing. So, you know, the whole like anyone who doesn't go to our church is going to hell, like I could that thought bothered me about a lot of people, in my life, but especially bothered me about her because I was like, I loved her. I still love her, but she was just like one of the most important people in my life, and she was good as far as I could tell. Like
Hmm.
she believed in Jesus, but she was caring, she was funny, she was smart, she was like like sassy and strong-willed, and um, I was like, God's really gonna send her to hell because she thinks my church is weird, like
Yeah.
um so I would say, there were times when things like that would come up. And if I had problems or I felt weird about something, oftentimes my mom would just say, well, tell your friends that your parents are making you do it. Like if you just feel too uncomfortable about something, like just tell your friends your parents are making you. And so I think that was kind of how I managed to kind of like navigate that cognitive dissonance of like,
Hmm.
I have these doubts, but this is my whole family and an important part of my community. And I believed in God and I wanted to believe in God and I wanted to be good. So, like, that kind of that, well, my parents say this is right. And I guess it is right. And I'm just not going to think too hard. The doubts would come up, but then I would try to like push them to the side. Um,
Hmm.
you know? So I think that's when it started to get weird, was kind of like mid to late high school. But I still stayed in the church through all of college. Um, I've heard others on the podcast talk about this before, and I would say campus ministry was ultimately ended up being like the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of my like ability to continue in the church. Uh,
Hmm.
I mean, I still had a lot of great friends in the campus ministry. Still am friends with a couple of people from that time period. So there's no one person that I would want to like throw under the bus. But just that the expectations were very high, of
Yeah.
like,
Hmm.
okay, Sunday church, Wednesday church, Thursday Bible talk, Friday night, everyone's hanging out, Saturday, everyone's hanging out, like basically 6 to 7 days a week, there would be at least some campus ministry thing that was required.
Hmm.
Um, and, you know, it meant that I didn't have time to do a lot of other things. And I didn't really feel the kind of the freedom that I think I was expecting to feel like going off to college. I moved to a different city from where my parents were living, but it was like 3 hours away in the same state. So, a lot of the people in the church in the city where I was in college knew my parents. So I think there was a certain amount of like pressure. By that point in time, my parents had become elder and elder's wife in the church
Oh,
in the city where they were living, where I grew up. They weren't paid elders, like they weren't on the staff, but they were, recognized as
yeah.
elders. And so there was like kind of that additional pressure of like, elders' kids have to be good examples,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, so I felt a lot of pressure to like uphold everything. But I also started questioning the logic of all of it. So it was like the pressure of the expectations of like, be here, do this, do this. And then also the logic of it started not to make sense to me. Like the logic of how we were taught. And for me, it wasn't necessarily like from a scientific perspective. I know some people kind of become skeptical of Christianity when they get deep into like, I don't know, evolution or something like that. For
Hmm.
me, it's always like, whatever. Like, I'm not worried about that, but it was like the emotional and the spiritual logic of it. The, I don't know. I guess we just can't understand why God's going to condemn like most of 6 billion people at the time on earth to hell. Like, that's God's business. After a while, I just felt like I couldn't believe in that kind of God. Um, but I felt like I kind of had to stick it out through all of college. Because my parents were putting a good amount of pressure on me. And I told them I was going to talk about this on the podcast. So they know, and we have talked about this, and this is something we are past as a family, I would say. But I was fortunate that my parents were paying for college. But they also told me that if I stopped going to church, they would stop paying for college. Um,
Dang.
yeah. So there was just a lot of pressure to like, I don't know, keep up appearances, if you will.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if your parents are elders, then there's this assumption that all the kids are going to be brought up. I mean, that biblical. There's a scripture
Yeah.
about that,
Yeah.
and that's got to be challenging. Which is something that I'd love to talk to more people about. This, like, because the pressure of having to be something because your parents are this or that. Like
Huh.
I didn't necessarily have that. My parents were loved and supported by a lot of the church. I mean, they were been there for so long, but they were never elders or leaders or something like that. So I never felt that. But that has got to have been intense to like navigate, especially when you're in college and you're trying to, I don't know, be free, figure out
Yeah.
your path, figure out who you are, all that stuff.
Yeah. It was a lot of pressure. Um,
Hmm.
and sort of not necessarily, so I don't really have like a huge wild streak. Like even after I left the church, I didn't go like crazy wild. It's not that I never had any craziness, but it wasn't because I like wanted to run off and, go go drinking downtown when I was 20 and the church wouldn't let me. It was more just like, I just want to be free to like read what I want to read, think what I want to think, spend time with the people I want to spend time with, like not feel like my world has to be so narrow.
Yeah.
Um, because on the one hand, we were talking about there was this kind of positive aspect to the church in terms of like diversity, which is true. But on the other hand, there was like a lot of narrowness when it came to like, you can experience diversity, but it must be within this sphere. It must be within this bubble.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, you know, so there was just this kind of like on my part, a desire to be able to like think more freely.
Hmm.
Um, I think you and I may have talked about this before, but the idea that like you can question, questioning's great. We want you to question. But just so you know,
Yeah. Hmm.
the answer to the question is this.
Yeah. It's like you can question as much as you want to, as long as you get to the same conclusion that we've gotten to.
Correct.
There were like, you can read that book, but just understand it's not from like one person from our church. I remember that with when the Velvet Elvis came out by Rob Bell. I remember that being labeled as a dangerous book to
Yeah.
read.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's funny because once I read that, then everything sort of shifted in my brain. And that's probably why they said it was dangerous. And I was like, whoa, this is interesting. Okay. Wish I'd read this book earlier.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, his books I think are it was it was one of the first times that I could be like, "Oh, I can think about things differently." Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
It's more expansive than this.
Yeah.
Huh, interesting. He was like a door to a whole bunch of stuff.
That's so cool.
hmm Yeah, he's written. Hold on, I'm looking at my bookshelf. He's one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. I think like 8 or 9 books. One of his books was called Love Wins, where he questions the idea of hell, and
Yeah.
that's what he was on Time Magazine's label for America's New Heretic. So people did not like that book. It's a great book, by
Oh,
the way. I
cool.
recommend reading that book. It's awesome.
Cool.
But yeah, we couldn't, the narrative was like controlled, and they wanted to keep it that way for us in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
I would say just because you made me think of it on the topic of like things that kind of like, open your mind. I'm making
hmm
hand gestures on a
Yeah,
podcast.
sure.
Uh, but
Yeah.
uh, mind blown emoji.
hmm
That like, so I was a history major in undergrad, and I took this class that was about the history of history. And so we were kind of looking, it was as meta as it sounds. So we were looking at history from this kind of like meta historical lens. So thinking about like, how have people of the past told history? And one of the things that we talked about in that class or like different ways that people in the past have thought about how like time works
hmm Yeah.
and that affects your view of history.
hmm
So like for most Christians, history has an end point, right? That it's
hmm Yeah.
like history is moving in a direction towards like Christ's return, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it kind of depends on what flavor of Christian you are. If you think the world's going to become like a dystopian nightmare and right before Jesus comes back, or if you think like it's our job to make the world a paradise on earth so that Jesus will want to return. Like there's different schools
hmm
of thought. Um, but then we learned about like other ways that people have thought about how time works, like this historian Hegel, who also had what you might think of as like a progressive view of history, thinking that history like moves in a direction, but it didn't have anything to do with God. It just had to do with like ideas changing over time and like
hmm
society will just keep getting better. And it just was one of those like the more I won't go into all of it, but like the more I learned about different ways that people thought about how history even worked or how time even worked, I was like, oh, so ours is just one version of many of like thinking about how like thinking about the meaning of all of this, thinking about like what happens on earth, like is there a purpose to what we're doing? Like who decides? Is there a direction to history? And it just was like I don't
Yeah.
have to be like stuck in this narrative. I can find a different narrative,
You could. Yeah.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to this thought of like, because you're saying like the Christians and this one view of history, and this is the way it's going to be. And I keep thinking, is the Bible the sacred text,
Hmm.
or is the Bible a sacred text?
Right. Yeah.
And when I started to think about that, it shifts everything
Yeah.
because I think, speaking of history, you spend some time with the history of how the Bible was formed. you start to see a few things that don't necessarily line up
Right.
in the way that like we were taught the Bible was,
Right.
and then you start to see how literary devices were used in the stories and how like, oh, that story in the Epic of Gilgamesh really lines up with Noah's story.
Yeah.
That's interesting,
Yeah.
and like how all these other cultures had a great flood. And so there's all this stuff. And it's not like I think I want to negate anything. I just want to like understand that like it's a part of a bigger like everybody's saying the same thing in a
Yeah.
sense. These so it's like they're just trying to make sense of what they see with what they've got.
Yeah.
And like we're all doing the same thing, you
Yeah.
know, which is that was kind of something where I'm like thinking about that because it's like I don't know if the Bible is a sacred text, then yeah, we can study it. And if you find meaning in it and if it touches your heart and pulls on the strings and gives meaning to things, then right on,
Yeah.
like let's do it. But it's such a struggle for me to think of it as that is the sacred text.
I mean, I'm with you on that. Uh,
But I say that because we were the kingdom. We
right.
were
Right.
the way. We were this. We were right. Everyone else is wrong.
Yeah.
So that's where it struggles because I'm like, I don't think we were. We were
Yeah.
a way. We were a way. Sure, we were a way.
Yeah.
But it's
But
go ahead.
but to call ourselves the way is like incredibly
Yeah,
presumptuous.
it
Um,
is. It is.
did
But
you
that's why
Oh, I'm
I'm sorry,
sorry.
go ahead. I was just gonna say it's that's why they control that's why there was a lot of like don't you can question, but like come on, you still need that. Just talk to us. Keep talking to us.
Right.
Don't
We
talk to
have the
anyone else.
answers.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, did you grow up with the phrase the one true church? Was that bandied about when where you were?
The one true church. We were the God's modern. My favorite one was God's modern day movement.
Yes. I can still picture the guy on KNN saying that. Yes.
Jeez, frickin'
Oh,
KNN.
yeah.
Gosh, have you
So
gone on
funny.
YouTube to look at those?
I
There's
have
some on
not.
YouTube.
Are there? That would be
Yeah.
a I think I'm in a place mentally where I could handle viewing that.
Uh-huh.
Um, sort of like on the theme of the podcast that you were doing, maybe 5 years ago, a friend of mine, no connection to the church, just someone I'm friends with now. She's someone who likes to listen to podcasts about cults.
Yeah.
And she came across, I forget which podcast it was, but she came across like a two-part episode. She was like, "Hey, I think this was the church you were raised in." And I was like, "Oh yeah, it was." And I listened to the episodes and it was like the episodes reminded me of things that I think I had like blocked out.
Yeah.
Um, that I actually had forgotten about KNN
Oh
somehow.
yeah.
And then when I listened to the podcast, I was like, "Oh my gosh, how did I forget that that was a thing?" Now I
Yeah.
can remember it. Just sort of funny how I think our brains like try to protect us a little bit from
Hmm.
like my best friend from high school remembering that I would call her every summer distraught about the state
Yeah.
of salvation. Like, I don't remember doing that. And part of me thinks that there's probably some other stuff from that time period that I don't remember because it
Yeah.
was traumatic enough that my mind was like, let's filter that experience out. I don't know.
I wish that I had that because I remember way too much. Maybe that's why I'm at this point I'm doing this podcast because I can remember all these things, you know?
I mean,
Sometimes I feel like I wish I had a filter.
well, I hope that the process of doing this at least helps you to like find some healing as much as
Oh
your brain
yeah. Hmm.
healing to the rest of us who get to like share our stories.
It is healing every time because it's a time to sit down with people that I don't have to explain a lot of things to. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of people, I've said this many times, I'll say it every time I'm on here, but like it's incredibly powerful to be like in a place where you can like, this is what I went through and somebody gets it, you
Yeah.
know, because then you immediately know that you're not alone. You immediately know that you're not as crazy as you thought, and you immediately feel connected and like, okay, it's like, all right. Because for me, I feel like it's okay to feel what I feel because there's lots of other people that feel it too,
Yeah.
you know? And I wish more people could do that with anything because our lives are incredibly like secluded. We're not connected to each other. We're not connected, and we're just the more technology comes along, the more we're progressing. I feel like the further away we're getting from each other, more isolated. That's the word.
Yeah. I mean, um, first of all, I'm sorry to hear that you feel that way. That sounds
It's okay. It's
that
okay.
sounds hard. And
Wait,
yeah,
what do you mean? Like feel that we're isolated?
yeah, like that.
Oh, I just feel that like in general as like a society,
Yeah.
like the way that you see how people are, you know, we're
Yes.
we can like get our groceries delivered. We don't have to leave our houses. A lot of people don't, you
Yeah.
know, we don't we as a society we don't communicate like maybe we used to. I don't know, and just people just aren't in each other's lives like they used to be. So I think that like I it feels like I'm observing, it just feels like people are just in their own little bubbles and they just end up thinking that they're the only ones that are feeling whatever it is they're feeling,
Yeah.
you know?
I do feel like technology has created kind of like a double-edged sword of like on
Hmm.
one hand, I do know people find communities online that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Like, some of my queer friends have talked about how the internet kind of saved them when they were,
Yeah.
young and queer and living in an area where it was dangerous for them to be young and queer.
Hmm.
I think it has the possibility to provide community, but at the same time, there may be less of the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of like hanging out with the people in your neighborhood or, fewer people go to church than ever before in our country, I think. And like church can be a place of gathering and community. I also have wondered, I do feel like that feeling of isolation and loneliness is not unique to people who grew up in the ICOC, but I also wonder to a certain extent if there's like kind of an extra feeling of like an absence of something because like for all the detriment that comes from being in a culty environment, there's also that sense of like there are people who are here for you.
Hmm.
Now, not everybody experienced that equally and not everybody experienced that positively, but there is this kind of like intensity to it, right? Like we're
You had a
together.
community, you had people to go to.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think there's just we were just like what we were a part of, I don't think was normal
no.
because it was so isolated, right? And so I do think a lot of it when we have like we had the community, we had the people, we had this, we had that, we had all of these other things that normal most people don't have. You
Yeah.
leave it and it's gone. So there's
Yeah.
this hole in your life that becomes hard to fill
Yeah.
because in a lot of ways we were forced, but in a lot of ways it just, like you've said and when you've said numerous times, you were around each other 5 days a week.
Yeah.
So you have this just community of people and you're going to see them and you're going to talk to them and you're going to relate to them and you're going to when you're hurting they're going to be there with you, you know.
Yeah.
And so to lose that is challenging. It's incredibly like isolating in a sense that like no one's going to get it. No one's gonna
Yeah.
get what I'm feeling, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Because it
And it's
also made sense to where we're from, where we're going, and why does it all mean, you
yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. There's so I read this book several years ago called Strangers Drowning, and it talks about people who try to like live out an ethical system or a moral system like to the maximum,
Yeah.
and what does that do to them. And so it's all different kinds of case studies, like a married couple who decides that it's their calling in life to like adopt as many children as they possibly can and provide foster care for as many children as they possibly can, and like kind of what happens to them and their children when they do this.
Yeah.
Another person who decides that like philosophical altruism is the way to live, and so on and so forth. But one of the chapters talks about a woman who, had kind of gone through this process of trying to be like supremely devoted to her philosophical system, and then she reached a point where she rejected Christianity, she rejected like all these things. And I happen to have like the quote on my door over here. What was left? Could you base a life on ideals that you invented? Nothing larger, nothing more than that? Question mark. Um, and then, it was all she had. Um, like you go from having this like all encompassing, all explaining thing to just kind of being like, well, that didn't work. So I guess I'm left with me. And
Yeah.
is that even allowed? Like, am I allowed to just, I mean, in my opinion, the answer is yes. Like you are allowed to create your own values and your own ideals and
Hmm.
draw from all kinds of sources that you find meaningful. But that kind of like uncertainty and almost like going down a roller coaster feeling, like your
Yeah.
stomach comes up in your throat or whatever. Like, oh, I'm alone now. What do I do?
Hmm. It's incredibly, I mean, it's frightening to be in a space where like I could think I when you're saying that quote, it's like when I left and I felt this like you feel like I can go anywhere, I do anything, but what does anything really mean?
Yeah.
And you're like, If this is wrong, then what's right?"
Yeah.
And the uncertainty of being wrong, like, or not the uncertainty of things is hard to deal with, but also like if I go down this road, it could be wrong too,
Yeah.
and we love we as people, I think, love really nice, easy answers
Yeah.
that wrap it all up. Um, so
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like a security and
Mhm.
safe and feeling of safety that comes from, I think I have it all figured out.
Mhm.
Um, at least that's my sense, is that a lot of people get a certain like some certainty and some security from feeling like they know what's right, or they know the quote unquote truth. Um,
Confidence when you're walking around talking to people.
yeah.
Nah, I got the answers, bro. You know,
Yeah.
I got the answers. Come talk to me, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I
Yeah. I
wanted to
feel
go,
like, oh,
oh,
you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I wanted to go back to the friends talk, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I have a similar instance because, I left the church my junior year and then came back after I had graduated. So, it was like I spent about a year and a half, 2 years out. And so I had made friends that were really amazing. It was like I made the friends that everyone said I wasn't going to make,
Yeah.
because if you left. And so when I came back to church in college, I would still hang out with some of these people. And
Yeah.
it was always, I think, like, hmm, it was always weird to think that like because you would hear the messages about your best friends need to be in this room and you don't need to be hanging out with these other people
Yeah.
and it never like it was always a challenge for me up until when I left to only hang out with people that were part of the church.
Yeah.
For one, because it just sometimes I was bored,
Yeah.
you know?
Uh, I mean, that was maybe the one rule that I never really followed. I always had a ton of friends who weren't part of the church.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
and I tried to be like very good at adhering to like the moral boundaries of the church, even when I spent time,
Yeah.
you know,
Hmm.
I was in this like honors program in undergrad, and I had a couple of girlfriends, from the honors program who were for sure not part of the church and were for sure not interested. And we had started like a weekly dinner club. And then our honors program had like a dance, like a formal, and we all went together and like they all partied and drank and stuff, but I was like, I didn't. I just went with them and had fun and had a good time, but I just didn't, So I guess maybe from a certain perspective, I was walking the line there, from the perspective of the church. But I think that was the one rule that I just kind of consistently and quietly didn't abide by.
Yeah.
Because I
I
could.
think yeah, I don't know. I got myself into some situations for sure with friends that were, we were having some fun, but I don't know. It's like if this person is genuine and kind and empathetic, I was like,
Why shouldn't I talk to you? Why shouldn't I hang
yeah,
out?
why can't we hang out? Like, what are you gonna do? Like, force me to leave the church? Like, what is this person gonna do? Like, no one in my life, friends that I had were like forcing me to do anything,
No,
and
no. And
yeah,
that was something that I learned too from at least the friends that I had in high school and especially in college. Like, the kind of like caricature that I think, especially we grew up in the 90s, like the just say no,
uh-huh, yeah,
uh, that like there'd be someone at the party that would be like, just do the cocaine, just do the cocaine.
yeah.
Not that there was even, I mean, if there was cocaine at these parties, I was certainly not aware of it, but like nobody did that. Nobody was like, you gotta get drunk, Rachel, like get drunk. Nobody was doing
Hey
that.
man, you gotta smoke these drugs with us. You have
Yeah.
to. Come on.
Yeah.
It's just that was but like that's what we're fed. We're
Yeah.
fed those things and that's what you go to believe and oh,
And I'm not saying no one has ever experienced the pressure to do things they didn't want
sure,
to, but
sure.
at
Yeah.
least the people that I was making friends with, like they were good,
Hmm.
decent people, and none of them were like, "Oh my gosh, you have to do this thing that we're all doing." It was just like, "Okay,
Yeah.
we know you're
Mhm.
kind of our weird Christian friend, but we like you." So,
You can hang out. It's fine. That's
yeah.
cool. Yeah. Um, you mentioned this toxic diet culture
Yeah.
when we were talking on the phone. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is something I've done a lot of thinking about and a lot of reflecting about in the last maybe
Mhm.
5 to 6 years. Just like for context, um, when I was a child, I was always like kind of chubby, a little bit fat, and then um, perhaps after we moved a couple times, I was like putting on more weight. And again, growing up in the 1990s, there was this kind of like fixation on like, and which is not to say it didn't get worse after the 1990s, but there was in the 1990s this kind of like kids should not be fat, kids should not be overweight.
Mhm.
Um, and the low fat craze or whatever. So I think the first time I went on a diet, I was like maybe 9 or 10 years old. And I, did lots of different diets throughout my childhood, off and on. My mom and I would do diets together sometimes, soup diets, this, that. I did Weight Watchers many times.
So
So there
many
was
diets back then. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're saying
no,
that now. There were so many diets.
I mean, there's still so many diets, but yes, there was like the Atkins diet
Yep.
and fake Atkins diets, and of
South
course
Beach was the South Beach
South
diet back then
Beach,
too.
that was a
Yeah.
thing. Yes. Of course, there was
Yeah.
always Slim Fast, you know.
Oh, Slim Fast, those shakes.
Yeah. I think the worst, like the most unappealing diet I did was one of the first ones I did as a kid. It was the soup diet, where you
Oh
would
man.
like just lots and lots of this vegetable soup, which basically has no calories because it's just like tomatoes and onions and carrots that have been like cooked down to the point that they're almost mush. And I remember being on the soup diet when I was in sixth grade, um, because my mom packed my lunch for me every day. Thank you, Mom. That was so dear and kind of you. But when I was on
Hmm.
this diet, I'd be in the cafeteria eating this cold vegetable soup because there was nowhere to warm up the soup, and I can still taste it. Like I can still taste this cold vegetable soup.
Oh
Oh,
God.
yeah. And then like on the soup diet, there would be like one day a week you could eat a baked potato, and like one day a week you got like a piece of steak, and like baked potato day was just like, because I mean, I still love potatoes.
Yeah.
It was like the
I had some
best
for dinner.
day.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if that's when my obsession with potatoes began, being denied them on a regular
Was it
basis.
like a loaded potato? Like when you say baked potato, you're gonna put the cheese, the sour cream, the meat, the chives, all of that?
I think we were
Or
allowed to put butter on it.
oh, okay.
It wasn't the full potato experience, but so all that to say, long history of dieting all through my childhood, teens, and up. I would say the last time I went on a diet was in my late 20s. Although I kind of got tricked into intermittent fasting in my mid 30s. That's another story.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
um, and I would say toxic diet culture, this kind of like obsession with what the body is supposed to look like and how the body is supposed to be.
Mm.
And I would say that was kind of like broadly part of American culture. It wasn't just in our church, but I do remember having conversations with adults in my life who were part of the church that would like express um, concern, quote unquote,
Yeah.
concern
Hmm.
because of how fat I was. Um, there was a lot of pressure to conform to like the body standards of, the women's ministry leaders in the church. And there was, of course, there was a certain amount of diversity, but a lot of times it would be like a young, very fit white couple, and the wife
Yep.
would be quite thin. Um,
Hmm.
and so there was this kind of tying of the cultural obsession with thinness to the religion and to Christianity, and this belief that like if I were truly honoring God, I would be able to have self-control over my body and I wouldn't be fat anymore because I would be like eating in a way that honored God, and I would be, I wouldn't be like binging or gluttonous or any of these things. Um, I
Hmm.
remember my mom kind of going through similar things at the same time as me, and someone once telling her that they had a hard time respecting her as a mentor in the church because my mom was like struggling with her weight.
Oh
Um,
shit. Fuck.
yeah. So there was this kind of like, this pressure. And then of course I think it tied, I can only speak to the female side of this. I
Hmm.
imagine that men also experience some pressure to lose weight and have a certain body type, but there was this like focus on, especially once you get to be a teenager, you've got to be like beautiful and kind and good and serving and loving and thin so that like a man will want to marry you. So for me, I experienced what I would call toxic diet culture. You know, I was taught to ignore the cues and signals of my body's telling me I'm hungry, but I've already eaten lunch and I only can have so many calories today. So I'm going to ignore my body when it's telling me I'm hungry.
Can I
Um,
pause you just for a second?
yeah,
Is
absolutely.
a doctor telling you this, or was it someone from church telling you this?
When I was in the third grade, my mom took me to a dietitian who said
Uh,
that I was overweight and I needed to work on my diet.
okay,
So there was some medical intervention, but I would say my memory, and I could be misremembering, was
sure.
that this came more so from church and from the broader culture and less so from doctors.
Yeah, I just wanted to make
That's
that
a good
point
good clarification. Yeah.
because, only because like I hear, I've had women on here that have talked about this prior, even in the last episode I just did, this girl sister from what she was saying that they told her she was too fat to study the Bible, stuff like
Yes. I heard that. I listened to that episode.
that.
Gosh,
So
that's awful.
I just want to clarify, like, it's different from like a doctor telling you, like, hey, let's try this versus
Yeah.
someone in the church that is just like, no, you need to look like this, or it's, it's saying like God wants you to look like this, or a man's not going to want you, or any kind of like bullshit like that,
Yeah.
you
Yeah. It
know?
was mostly not coming from medicine.
Got it.
Uh, and I kind of feel like there's some parallels, we were kind of taught, I would say we were taught to ignore our instincts about
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
I'm not saying one should follow all of one's instincts because
Sure.
it can
You pass a Taco Bell, you know, maybe I don't need to have that Taco Bell right now. That's
yeah,
different than,
maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you're really hungry and you only have $5 and Taco Bell's the right thing for you,
sure. Hmm. Yeah.
Um, but my point being, there was this kind of like, I had this instinct that there were good people who were worthy of love outside the church and who maybe had ideas that were worth listening to, but the message was ignore those instincts because they're wrong. And then kind of similar things with my experience of like my body and food and eating, like, oh, I'm really hungry right now, but I'm not going to eat because it's not time to eat, or because I've already eaten lunch today and I'm not eating dinner until 7, or even going to a pizza party and like I will have exactly one slice of pizza and I will just eat carrot sticks like the whole night. Just this kind of like, it doesn't matter if my body's like, damn, that pizza was good. You can have another piece of pizza, you know?
Uh-huh.
Um, this kind of like whatever you think you're doing is wrong.
Yeah. That's just how we were. It insert diet, insert anything in life. What we were thinking was wrong,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
I would say as an adult, I still, one of the things I still work on in therapy, and I've been in therapy for 8 years now, is this kind of
Nice.
tendency. I'm grateful. I have a really great
Yeah.
therapist and the resources to go. Um,
Oh yeah.
Still working on the idea of like that there's like the best way to do something, or like the
Mhm.
right way or the correct way. And of course,
Yeah.
there are circumstances in which there is a correct way to do something. Like you
Yeah.
have to fill out your application for your passport correctly, or you won't get a passport. But like,
Yeah.
there's
Hmm.
so many things in life where it's like, well, there's probably not really even a best way to do it. Like, whatever way is fine. Like, it just needs to get done, like it's
Yeah,
okay.
totally.
You don't have to
I
always do it the
I
best.
feel like there's eyes on me at all times. That's what I talk
Yeah.
about in therapy sometimes. Or like every bad thing that happens in my life is because of something I didn't do, like,
Yeah.
right, spiritually. So
Well,
anyways,
everyone who knows the good he ought to do but doesn't do it
said I know, right?
sins, right? So like
Jeez.
Damned if you
Talk
do,
about
damned if you
triggering.
don't.
Talk about
Yeah.
triggering scripture.
Sorry. I should
It's
have given you
okay.
a content warning.
It's
Uh,
okay. But yeah, so this the that has got to like it from what I'm hearing, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It just sounds like all of what happened is it just makes you neurotic,
yeah.
and it's hard to I don't know how I mean we have that. I deal with the body issues as well.
Yeah.
Like I think that for men it's a strength thing. We have to be, I don't know, insert whoever is particularly strong right now. We have to Hugh Jackman. I don't know.
Sure.
We
Yeah.
we have to be that. And if we're
Yeah.
not that, then we don't have value to protect or provide for a woman,
Yeah.
right? Where you guys have that, it's how you look. If you don't look a certain way, then a man's not going to find value in you, and
Yeah.
but then the thing that always I struggle, it's hard to hear is that they feel like you're at where you are because of a lack of self-control. And that's it, right?
Right. Right.
Because there are many factors that come into it. Like for me, mine is like I had umpteen rounds of antibiotics as a kid. That did something to my gut. I
Yeah.
had multiple rounds of steroids due to ear issues that never got fixed. That tweaks your tweaks your body in a way too.
Yeah.
And then there's like other genetic things that come into play where it's like you might have a genetic marker for this and your environment is like this and then all of a sudden this is happening. And so hormone levels or your and I was talking about my therapist about this stuff today. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's interesting that you're on the that talked about this. I had to and I prefaced that by saying, but like I was weighed before going onto a water ride the other week,
Oh, no. Oh,
and it
boo.
and it
Oh,
blinked red, and I had to do a walk of shame because this 17-year-old lifeguard said I was too too large to get on a ride. But anyway,
oh,
but
gross.
like
Not you, the weighing you
yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah, and it was just it was weird. But like I'm just like it's not just a self-control thing. Sure, if you're eating, if you're having like all of this, I mean, there's things that you can talk about in a healthy way, but like for someone to sit here that's not a doctor or someone or professional in that to say it's just self-control. It's
Yeah.
like it's not a productive narrative. It just breeds that neurotic self-hate stuff. I don't know, am I right? I mean, is it not am I right, but like does it track with what you're thinking?
Yes.
Maybe some.
I would say, I think I really like what you're saying about how each person has individual health factors that affect
Mhm,
what their bodies look like. One of the things that actually contributes to weight gain is dieting.
mhm,
Um, like the more the more diets you go on, like diets are ineffective in the long term in something like, I don't know, 98% of cases or 95% of cases. I don't remember the exact statistic off the top of my head. And what happens in your body is that, like, when you go on a diet and you lose a lot of weight and you inevitably go off the diet because whatever reason, your body will go I apologize to anyone for whom this might be triggering, but like you might go through a phase of feeling like you just can't stop eating when you've been on a diet for a while.
yeah,
And your body will adopt a new set point and a higher set point for its weight because it's afraid, not like consciously, but it's programmed to be like, well, we went through this 2 or 3 year period where we didn't have enough to eat. So I guess I better gain a little extra weight so that the next time that comes around, I'll have the reserves I need. And so, like, the more you do that, the more weight you're going to gain long term, and it messes with your metabolism too. So it's
sure.
like Plus,
Mhm.
there's individual genetics, health concerns, medications, like all kinds of things. So this kind of like, um, oh, it's just about self-control. It really minimizes the fact that people are individuals with different experiences, right?
Yeah.
Different needs.
Hmm. And to make matters worse, we get thrown on the fact that God probably thinks less of you.
Yeah.
The creator of everything, the source of all of this, is looking down on you and saying, I can't believe you did this. You like gluttonous piece of crap.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's a double whammy.
Yeah. It's like not just have you failed in society's expectations, but you've also failed God, you know.
Hmm. And how do you, how do you come back from that?
Um, I
I don't
don't know.
know.
I stopped trying.
Yeah.
Not
It's
that
just,
sounds
it's like,
really dumb, but like I freed myself from that paradigm. Let me put it that
like,
way.
let's have conversations about like health in a productive way
Yeah.
instead of forcing people to be a certain way.
Yeah.
That feels right. Like that feels good, right? Like,
Yeah.
and like, yeah, I mean it's hard when you try things and it doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
I'm
I
like
think,
that,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's hard when something doesn't work. It's discouraging. And then the way we were raised was to turn that in on yourself and be like,
Yeah.
how
Hmm.
how am I failing? You know, what am I
Hmm.
doing wrong? What is the sin that I'm committing that's like contributing to me staying in this like
Hmm.
shameful body or whatever? Um, and I was gonna say also that I think that kind of approach was like part and
Oh,
parcel with,
shameful body. Oh,
sorry.
sorry. It's just like what a fucked up thing to think, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Like,
sorry.
well, no, but even within that worldview, one
Huh?
could say like that is a body that God made, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
But at least from my perspective, that was not how I was encouraged to think about my own body. I wasn't
Hmm.
encouraged to think about it as like something good, something beautiful, something of God. You know, I was encouraged to think of it as this kind of like prison of flesh, you know,
Prison of flesh.
like manifestation of all the temptations and, you know, not thinking about,
Hmm.
oh, if we're, if God is, if we are really made in God's image, right? If human beings, I'm not saying I necessarily do or don't believe that now, but like in theory, if we're made in God's image, then why does there need to be so much shame and so much hatred directed at who you are in your spirit, who you are in your body, who you are in your heart? Like, you know, if God made those things, then they should be good.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
like
of
inherent,
course.
there's goodness there.
It should start from inherent goodness.
Yeah.
But because that one guy back in the 1800s, what was his name? With the original sin, because he couldn't figure out how to stop something. There's a guy, I wish I had his name, and
Yeah.
then where the original sin comes from, and then it's like we're
Yeah.
just, here we
Fallen
are thinking
day
about this
one.
still. Yeah,
Yeah. Thanks, guy.
yeah.
Um,
Thanks, creator of, but it's just because it doesn't make sense that a creator of the creator of everything would create something inherently bad, right?
right.
So
Yeah.
like
Uh,
there's conversations that might need to be like, for me, someone had to have a conversation because I was having 7 Mountain Dews a day. Like
sure.
that needed to be talked about. 'Cause that's a lot of Mountain Dew. That's a lot of
Right.
sugar.
How do you feel when you drink seven
Yeah.
juice
But
a
it,
day?
it wasn't in like a shameful way. It was just like, hey man, that's a lot of Mountain Dew. Yeah, you're okay. Thanks for telling me.
Yeah.
But instead of saying like, hey, you know, putting all this like extra shame and neurotic thinking onto someone who's already trying or just wanting to be or to exist. I mean, It's not
Yeah.
cool.
It's not cool. It's not cool at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the toxic diet culture in the church. That's something.
Yeah. And you and I have talked a little bit about like gender and gender roles in the church too. And I think
Yeah.
the
I was gonna
diet,
ask you, I was gonna lead right into that too. So here
yeah,
we
I think they're connected, right?
Yeah.
Part of why there's so much pressure on me as a teenager to lose weight and be thin is because there's this like ideal of femininity to which you should aspire. And you said
Hmm.
something similar, right? About like the type of man or masculinity that was upheld or valued in the
Yeah.
church.
Hmm.
And I think what our conversation has been making me think about is how there just wasn't a lot of um, options in terms of like role models or pathways to adulthood. There was kind of this one model that we were given as like, this is what you aspire toward, right? So if you're a woman, you want to find a man. If you're a man, you want to find a woman. You should
Hmm.
get married. You should probably get married young, because temptation and stuff.
Hmm.
And then have babies. And then if you're a woman, you're praised for being a good wife and having babies and being a good mom. And that's kind of, at least for me as a young woman in the church, I felt like that was the only, that's what you should aspire toward. And there really weren't any other examples upheld. There weren't like, this woman decided not to get married and she's just an awesome single woman in her 50s, loving life, loving God.
Yeah.
Oh, just not interested in dating, right? Same for men. There was just this
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
one, almost like one size fits all. I don't remember if I already said that earlier, but
Well, there
approach.
also was men could be praised for their accomplishments without it being known that they're a father.
Yeah,
If a
true.
woman does anything, it's also she does this and a mother.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like we could separate ourselves from the father role and just being like a rad man, where you guys it's never like that. It's never like this is a woman doctor. It's always like this is a woman doctor and she also juggles being a mom.
Right. Right. It's interesting. I have two divergent thoughts that I want to say about this topic. So, one, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about how interesting it is that we were often told to be like in the world, but not of the world.
Yeah. Hmm.
But then how much of like our culture actually seeped into the church and was presented as like these are what God wants when it's really like, well,
What the culture wants.
what the
Hmm.
culture wants.
Because it's the same thing outside the church.
Yeah,
You know, the way that you guys, women, are viewed, they're what they should be doing or should not be doing.
right.
Um, but it's also in every church, it's the same way. You know, we weren't special in that fact,
No,
but yeah,
no.
it's your value comes from the fact that you can, this is might sound harsh, that you can put out kids. And
Yeah,
so the value, the currency is the kids.
yeah, yeah. How many babies can you have? How many babies will you
Yeah.
have? And, will you stay home to take care of those babies?
And it's
Um,
not that way for us. Our value is a multitude of things,
yeah,
but it's the money you can provide, that kind of stuff.
yeah. I think part of what made it hard for me as a young woman in the church is that I just didn't really see any women who seemed like me that were undoubtedly there must have been some, right? I'm not that special a person. Like there
Mhm.
are other people out like me who exist in the world. But I didn't see women like me who were being like elevated to leadership. Not that you have to be elevated to leadership to be a good person, but that was so emphasized in our church
Mhm.
growing up. Like, you should be a leader. So, or like recognized or encouraged. I was super bookish, super academic. Wasn't one of the girls that the teen boys seem to be very interested in most of the time. Um, and so I honestly remember when I was a teenager that I used to have two specific nightmares, like nightmares that I used to have that I can remember having. One was that I would be forced to marry someone that I didn't like and then be forced to go be a missionary in some country I didn't want to live in. And I would have like vivid nightmares about this happening. And then the other was just that I would be like alone for my entire adult life because I didn't feel like I fit the model of like what a woman was supposed to be. Um, and I can remember times feeling resentful, thinking like if I were a boy, if I were a man, someone with my particular skill set or my aptitudes might have been encouraged to do one thing or another. But because I wasn't, no one was going to be like, oh, we should send Rachel to seminary and get her like trained up. I'm just not,
No, yeah, yeah. I'm
yeah,
I'm with you. We're
yeah.
with you. Hmm.
Or we should teach her how to lead the music ministry or, you know, um, these kinds of things that I love my brother, absolutely no shade on my brother. But like I would see my brother get tapped for certain opportunities or things like that. Not seminary, that wasn't his thing, but like leading in the music ministry, doing this, doing that, that like, we were close in age, we had similar aptitudes in certain areas. But I often was like, so the main reason that I'm not being asked to do any of these things is because I'm a girl.
Hmm.
And I'm kind of I feel like I don't fit the model of what like a woman or a girl is supposed to be in this community. So if I'm not allowed to date outside this community, I guess I'm just doomed for a lifetime of loneliness.
Jeez, that's a lot to carry.
Yeah. Um, it was yeah, a lot for somebody who was like 16 or 17. And I do know that part of being a teenager is being like, nobody loves me, everybody hates me. Like,
Yeah. Hmm.
um, but at least in my ideal world, you would think church might be a place where you'd be getting messages to counter that.
Well, this is the pushback I have is because this was supposed to be the place that was different.
Right.
This was supposed to be the place that was not of the world, right?
Mhm.
This is supposed to be the place where we're going to feel valued, seen, heard, and accepted. That's what
Right.
we're told,
Yeah.
but we weren't. You weren't. You had to be a man on stage. Women weren't allowed to talk, right? They were just supposed to sit in church, be quiet, and pop out kids. And that, because that's the godly way. And the moment that you don't fit into that, then automatically your value is gone. Same thing for a
Yeah.
guy. If a guy doesn't want to have kids, then what's the point?
Yeah.
You know? And
Yeah.
that are like, I don't know, like it's challenging because I don't know. It's challenging to because if this is supposed to be the place and it's not, then where is the place?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And why should it matter? I mean, why should it matter? Like guy, girl, why should it matter?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it should, but
Uh-huh.
clearly at that time
Hmm.
the gender the gender hierarchy and the gender paradigm the church was working with was well, it was a
Hmm.
hierarchy.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what would have happened if you would have spoken up though?
I don't know. I suspect I would have gotten discipled for that.
Yeah, you would have gotten discipled for that. Yeah.
uh,
Hmm.
I think, yeah, you know, um, I remember this conversely ended up being some of the best advice my campus minister ever gave me. although I don't know if it had the effect he was going for. But I do remember him telling me once, Rachel, you should really figure out like what you believe about this and where you want to go with this now. He was like, because the last thing you want to do is like get married and start having a family and then realize like 5 years in that you you really wish you weren't doing any of this. Um,
Like the family or the church?
both.
Oh,
um, yeah, we occasionally he and I would have some frank conversations. His parents had also been elders in the church, and but on the ministry staff, like paid staff elders. And so he could relate to some of the pressure that I was experiencing at that age, being like an elder's kid. Um, so I think there was a certain amount of like genuinely intended compassion of like, you should figure out if the church is what you really want before you like marry someone in the church and have a baby. And like, then it would like really mess up your life if you decided later you didn't want to be in this anymore.
hmm.
Um, So I imagine that what he would have wanted is for me to decide, like, yes, this is what I want. Um, but it was maybe some of the best advice that I got, weirdly, was like, well, if you think this isn't going to work for you, then like don't don't get deeper in.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
It's just, I think it puts this, the gender role or like the expectations put so much pressure
yeah.
on both sides, you know?
Yeah.
Like
Well,
I don't like living in a world where it's like you have to because this is who you are. You
yeah.
have to be this or that, right?
This is your biological and spiritual destiny.
Yeah.
You have a womb, you must fill it with a child. You have
Yes.
the
Uh-huh.
opportunity to fill a womb with a child, to contribute to that
Hmm.
process, if you will. You better do it.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
I mean, it's that with everything. It's with the because I'm a guy, I should look, act, and dress accordingly and
right.
be into these things. And you're a woman, you should, vice versa. And it's challenging when I'm not into a lot of those things. So
Yeah,
what does that mean about me? Is there
yeah,
something wrong with me?
yeah. If I don't want to do these things, if I don't like these things, if these things don't interest me, then I must
Mhm.
be faulty in some way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So did God make that mistake? That I'm into music and creative and that kind of thing, or that I as a kid I loved the color pink, but I was always so scared to wear the color pink.
Yeah.
That's so silly, right? That's such a silly thing, but that was ingrained, in me, right?
Yeah.
It's just, it's weird.
You reminded me when you were talking about being afraid to wear pink, you reminded me I went through like a little bit of a quote unquote tomboy phase.
Hmm.
Um, I think part of it was because I was a fat kid, and so I wanted to wear clothes that, didn't show off my body a lot. So I would wear like big, huge t-shirts. I went through a year, there was like a year when also, again, the 90s, I was wearing like oversized like baseball shirts with
Nice.
like baggy knee length shorts and like skater shoes. I wasn't a skater, I was a poser. I'm sorry, everybody. Um, but I that's what I felt comfortable in. But the clothes were kind of boyish by the
Yeah.
standards of
Mhm.
the time. And I do remember having conversations with my mom and maybe with some other women in the church where, it wasn't like you may not wear those clothes, but it was kind of like, you might want to start thinking about dressing more like a woman, as you're growing up, like you might
Yeah.
want to leave
Hmm.
those clothes behind. I'm like, I don't know. I was 11. Like, what's wrong with wearing a baseball shirt with Snoopy on it?
Yeah, you're also 11.
Like, everybody settle down. Um,
Hmm.
I also, not to go too far afield, but like from a puberty standpoint, I developed pretty early. So I think that was another reason why I was like, I had like woman body parts that most of my friends wouldn't have for like a couple more years. So like,
Hmm.
yeah, no wonder I was wearing like trying to dress like a boy and like oversized clothes and like I'm not comfortable.
Yeah,
It's fine.
hmm,
Like, who cares? Just let the child wear the clothes that she wants to wear.
yeah. There's more important things to worry about, right?
Yeah.
How about your happiness, your health? Are you finding joy in your life? Like those
Yeah.
type of things? I wonder what it's because like for me, like as you know, a man in church, like I saw what I could be. And
Yeah.
what I could be was a leader because they're all leaders.
Right.
And I wonder what that, I mean, that has got to be, if you're looking around and you're only seeing, like, what was that like? You're only seeing, oh, it's going to be this one way.
Yeah, I think it was hard.
Hmm.
I'm not saying it was something I thought about every day, but
Hmm.
um yeah, the idea that um the only people who got to lead, who really made decisions about what was happening were men. Yeah, it could be discouraging, you know? What if I wanted to take an active role in decisions that were made in the church? What if I thought I had a great idea for a sermon? I guess I better wait for our once a year Women's Day. And, you know, um,
Yeah.
yeah, it was discouraging. Like, my voice is only relevant if I'm speaking to other women. And then, even in
Mm.
that circle, it's more relevant if you have a man who's a leader. Like, if your husband's a leader, then your voice is more important. So there's really no pathway for, like, say, a single woman to have
Yeah. Hmm.
much of a role or a presence at all. Um, and I think I mentioned this to you in one of our previous phone calls. I kind of at the age of 18 was like, I don't think I want to have kids. And it wasn't like there was nothing malicious behind it, but I just kind of thought about like, what kind of a life would I have if I had children, and what kind of a life would I have if I didn't have children? And I was like, I think I would prefer a life where I didn't have kids. I was very driven academically. I was interested in having a career. And I know some people find a way to do both things, but I didn't see myself as the kind of person who would be able to do both things and like
Hmm.
if both things as much love and attention as I wanted to. And I checked in with myself about that in my 20s and in my 30s. And I was married for like half my 30s. And, at no point did I change my mind on this topic. But when I was in the church still, it was kind of like, well, what future is there for me? Just like
Hmm.
attending the singles ministry, like for the rest of my life. Um,
And that
not
was definitely the singles ministry didn't have you know, it wasn't the place. I remember being in campus. I remember being like, I didn't want to go to the singles ministry.
No, like it's not cool, and I don't agree with this perspective, but it was definitely viewed as like the unloved quote unquote the unloved stepchild of like all the ministries, right? Like,
Island of misfit toys.
yes, that's a better metaphor. Let's put it that way. Yeah, like
Mhm.
you don't want to go to the singles ministry, like that's the sad place, right? Because you haven't found somebody to
Mm.
marry yet. Um,
It's just weird that we buy into that kind of thinking.
mhm.
I don't know.
I haven't really looked into it much myself, but my mom told me that Gordon Ferguson, I think it was Gordon Ferguson, recently published a book about gender in the church. And like, have you heard about this?
I've heard about the book. Yeah. Hmm.
How could I get it so wrong? Um,
Well, I think the thing that I think about when it comes to like gender is like let's say you brought your thoughts up to a man in the church,
right.
like would not be received.
No, no, I can't. I mean, I couldn't even imagine having tried to have that conversation with a man in the church at that time.
I know.
Um, but
Which is we yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
oh, even if I had, like you said, I don't think it would have been received well. I think it would have been like, well,
Mhm.
you have to humble yourself before God, sister. You know, you have to be open to what God wants for your life. And like, you know, this is the path that God has chosen for women. So like submit, be
And
submissive.
it's not a woman saying it, it's a guy telling you this is the path God has chosen.
Yeah. I mean, I think women would sometimes reinforce that as well,
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
know. And again, this is not me trying to like throw shade on anybody who wanted to get married
Sure.
and have family. Like, that's awesome.
Hmm.
I hope you are happy,
Yeah.
but just that
Yeah.
that was that predetermined role.
When I left the church, the thing that I wanted to have was intentionality of my decisions
Yeah.
because I felt that everything that I was doing was because I had to.
Yes.
So everything that I was trying to do or think about being married, I wanted to be married. There was an idea, my now wife, I wanted to have this ceremony and make this commitment with her. It didn't mean that our relationship was less or more. It's just this what I wanted to do. I
Yeah.
thought about it. It was a few years before we got married. And it was purposeful because I didn't want to just do it
Yeah.
because you had to.
Yeah.
Same thing with kids. It was a talk I had to have because you know, you start I just remembered how many things I said just to say it. And I go,
Yeah.
yeah, of course I want to have kids. But then it's like, do I want to have kids? I don't know. This and something, and I don't want to just do it because I feel like I have to. And it took a couple years of talking and really wrestling with that. But there wasn't a lot of intentionality with us because there was no room for it. We just had to say and do a certain way. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And at least for me, when I first left the church, I mean, I still sometimes struggle with it now. But like trying to identify what I actually wanted was very
yeah,
hard.
it
Uh,
is. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. And I think I still sometimes look for that, like I was saying earlier, what's the correct thing? What's the right thing? What's the best thing to do? Wanting some sort of like external,
Yeah.
you know, and I think there's probably something very human about that to like want want someone to tell you what the right thing is to do. But the fact that I would question myself about so many things,
Yeah. Hmm.
um, and really didn't even know how to make decisions for myself, honestly.
Yeah.
When I,
Hmm.
when I first left the church, it was just like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to do, I don't feel like
Hmm.
I didn't know how to do anything,
Yeah. We didn't. I didn't, you know. It's like how to be, how to act, how to talk, you know, the things that we used to do and say aren't what a lot of people, you know, did. So like
Yeah.
we had to reacclimate ourselves to
Like
that.
a different world
Mhm.
view, a different way of speaking, talking,
Mhm.
behaving.
Yeah.
I
And
don't know
so
if you
like, oh, go ahead real quick.
I was gonna say, I don't know if you do this, but I still sometimes feel like I over explain. Like when someone invites me to do something and I can't do it, instead of just being like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't make it. I'll be like, well, I have these 17 things going on this week.
Yeah. Because you can't say no because they're going to be like, are you sure you can't? You
Yeah.
know, we couldn't say no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do that. Yeah. So like, just I'm laughing about times I've done that. Or I
Yes.
overshare everything because we were just so used to just telling everything about our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so what was the final thing that made you have to leave?
Mm. I remember the day. very well. I couldn't tell you the dates anymore, although maybe I could figure it out if I went back through my old journals. But it was my senior year of college. And as I said earlier, I'd kind of been going, I'd had this like struggle in college where I was like having my doubts. I had asked my parents if I could visit other churches. They had said no, or if you do, you still have to do all the same stuff for our church. There was, the question of whether or not I would be able to keep going to college if I left the church. So I had this kind of like moment my sophomore year of college where I was like, okay, well, I guess I can't not go to church. So like my junior year, I tried to like really be committed, which in retrospect is insane because I was already like very committed. Like, how much more committed could I possibly be? But I
Yeah.
tried to like really double down on it. And, it basically was like a year of kind of going through the motions where I was trying to like talk myself into I like stopping strangers on the street to invite them to church. Like, which just for my personality is like one of the worst possible things that I would have to do. Um, I love having 7 events a week. I want this. This is what I want. And then kind of the bottom fell out of that when I was heading into my senior year of college, but I felt like I had to hang on. So
Hmm.
I just kind of slowly started like during my senior year, like dipping a toe in like I went to that college formal that I mentioned
Hmm.
earlier in the podcast. Um, I let myself read things that I maybe felt like I shouldn't be reading. Um, and basically was determined that I would make it at least until I graduated. And then probably in one of my very last months of my senior year of college, the minister at the church gave this sermon, and he basically was like, in this church, we believe. And he had this whole like list of things. And he would say them, and then he would say, if you don't believe this, you don't belong here. And I couldn't tell you all the things on the list anymore, but one of the things I remember him saying with very vivid clarity was like, in this church, we believe that only Christians are going to heaven. And if you don't believe that, then this isn't the church for you. And I remember thinking, I don't believe that. Like, I'd kind of known for a while that I didn't really believe that anymore. But when he put it in those really stark terms of like,
Yeah.
we believe this, and if you don't believe this, you don't belong here. And by the time the sermon was over, I was like, I'm done. I know that I don't belong here. I don't believe any of the things he just said. I still waited a few more months until after I graduated to leave. But then about a month after I graduated, I had like tried to keep going for a while to like, I don't know, keep up appearances or I had decided to leave, but I hadn't like chosen the day or the hour or whatever. Um, so I just kind of faded away. And then I remember inviting my brother, and she's now my sister-in-law. At the time they were dating. Maybe they were engaged at that
Hmm.
point. And I had them over to my apartment and I was like, hey, I want y'all to know, like, I've decided I'm not going to go to church anymore. And I just don't feel like I belong here and I can't do it anymore. And they were both just like, yeah, we're not surprised. Because we had all gone to college together and I was and still am very close to both of them and they were just very loving about it. And then I sent my parents a letter letting them know about my decision, and that's probably too long of a story to like unfold here.
Sure. Yeah.
But um and so that was kind of how I had my official departure, was like telling my family. um and then I was given a year to find another comparable church to go to so that my parents could maintain their elder status if I found a church that our church would say was like okay enough.
Oh,
But
wow.
yeah, visited churches for a year and I was like, you know what? I just don't want to be with any of this right now.
Hmm.
I'm not ready to go through the ringer with a new group of people. And so my parents ended up having to like publicly step down from their eldership position. So anyway, that was kind of a long answer to your question, but I do remember that sermon very, very clearly. I remember that day and I was like, I'm done.
Wow. I mean, that's big of you to take a step for yourself to understand, even though knowing that with because the stepping down with the eldership, I know there's probably plenty of people that stay because of things like that.
You know, at the time I was in such deep psychological distress. I mean, this was 2006. It is
Hmm.
2024. So it's been almost 20 years. I have, as I mentioned earlier, I have had lots of therapy. So I'm now able to speak about it and I don't feel it the way that I
Hmm.
did then. But at that time, I was in such deep, dire distress that
Yeah.
I truly felt that leaving was the only thing I could do to like save my life. Not that I was contemplating self-harm or unaliving myself, but simply I could not envision a life in which I continued on the path that I was on. I felt
Hmm.
like the stress, the pressure, it was too much. Um, and so thank you for saying that. I do recognize that it took courage. But I also think that it
Yeah.
was the only thing that I could do at that time to
Hmm.
protect myself, you know, without going into some much deeper, darker hole psychologically.
Yeah. It's just it should always be celebrated when you're true to yourself, I guess, you know,
Yeah,
because you can only take so much, right?
I think so. I found my
Yeah.
limit.
Hmm.
I'll say, I can only speak for what worked for me, and that was just not the right environment for me to be able to flourish as a human being.
And so what was it like after
I
you
mean,
left?
gosh, I mean, that's been a whole 18-year journey, but the first couple of years were pretty hard.
Yeah.
I was so used to going to church every day that I would say for at least the first 2 years after I left church, on Sunday morning, I would like take myself out to breakfast and go journal somewhere, or
Go journal somewhere. That's great.
I've kept a journal since I was in the third grade. So,
Sure, sure, yeah. But
you
just
know,
no, just the act of like I have to go somewhere and do
I need my
something.
reflection time.
Yeah, your reflection
Um,
time. Hmm.
And I did that for a very long time. I also threw myself into graduate school basically a year after I left the church. And I think in some ways the church was very good preparation for grad school because I already was well trained to put up with a lot of like psychological suffering
Sure. Yeah.
and
Hmm.
used to people telling me that like this is the way you have to do things and um and also in some ways was able to retreat from the stresses in my family life and
Hmm.
my spiritual life by throwing myself so heavily into something else. Um, and I think I probably didn't really fully start trying to unpack, some of the hardest side effects of the church upbringing until after I decided to get a divorce, which was like
Hmm.
when I was 34. Um, and that's like a whole other long story, but
Yeah.
um, I think I used graduate school and, you know, to a certain extent my marriage as like ways to try to like shield myself from having to deal with
Hmm.
figuring out who I was and what I wanted. It was like, okay, well, I'll do the academia thing. And that's a path that makes sense. And I'll adopt a lot of the opinions of my partner who became my husband. Um, and I'll pour myself into that relationship because that's something I was kind of taught was the thing to do.
Hmm.
And then when I found that those paths were also not working for me, and I started going to therapy, and I would say that's when I really finally started to be like, well, what do I want? And how can I
Hmm.
go about getting that? And, you know, those kinds of things. So,
So was
yeah,
it therapy that helped you the most, or was there other things that you did that helped get you through it?
therapy for sure has been one of the most important things. I would also say, you know, this is just for me because I was already such a big reader that like
Hmm.
reading other people's perspectives on religion, on faith, in grad school, I did like a quote unquote minor in religious studies. So like thinking about religion, not just from a faith perspective, but from an intellectual perspective, for me, that was helpful. And then I would say friendships have honestly been maybe the most important part of my healing, making friends with people who were living life in a way that seemed more like what I wanted for my life.
Hmm. Yeah.
Writers, artists, musicians, creative people, people who are kind, people who care about making the world better.
Hmm.
Um, you know, People who maybe some of them who did have similar upbringings, others who were fully unencumbered by
Yeah.
you know so my friendships have been friendship therapy and like exposing myself to a lot of new ideas.
So like what would you tell someone who's like just left and wondering how do I get through it? What do you think you would tell them?
I would say first, I think I would say don't feel like you have to be in a rush to find a replacement.
Hmm.
I kind of I like went through a phase where I was kind of like hardcore atheist for a couple of years, which I now view as like a reaction against
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I'm personally now in a place where I actually feel more comfortable with the idea of uncertainty, and I feel safer when I don't have to commit too strongly to this is what I believe.
Hmm.
So I would say don't feel like you have to force yourself to find a replacement worldview right away. Like it is okay to question, and I mean that truly. I don't mean like it's okay to question, but like, this is like the answer you're supposed to come to. I mean, like,
Like
it's
question everything. Yeah.
yeah, it's fine. It's okay if you don't know. It's okay to experiment with different ideas and, you know, seek people in your life who are going to love you for who you are as
Hmm.
a person and not what you do for them,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and those people, I truly believe those people are out there to be found.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I don't
I
know.
like that.
Those are my thoughts.
I like that. You're the first person I've asked that because I just thought that. But I
It's a
think
really
that's
good thought.
something I think that's something that I need to start I'm going to incorporate in a lot more in more of these talks. Um, because I think my goal in this is us looking back in order to move to look forward, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think we were talking about this before we started recording, but the importance of being able to tell your story,
Hmm.
right? And that many of us, I think, in the church didn't feel like our stories were valued at the time when we were in the church. And something
Hmm.
that was hard for me when I first came out of the church was that I felt like my story had even less value because I had
Yeah.
taken it all so seriously, but I had chosen the quote unquote wrong answer. And so, like, my story doesn't fucking matter to anybody.
And they're going to make up their idea about you,
Yeah.
and they're allowed to, you
And
know?
they're allowed to tell whatever story they want to tell about who you are, why you left. I think I told you this on one of our phone calls that like the story going around about me in my former campus ministry was that I got too into existentialist philosophy and lost my faith because of like existentialism or something.
You know, when
Um,
I get into existentialism and that thought, the one thing that I always end up is I have to get out of it. I have to get out of existentialism because it's like
yes.
you get so lost in that, and like I, I always need grounding. There's always like, okay, I can only be in that mindset for a little bit.
Yeah.
So
I I was like a philosophy minor in undergrad.
uh,
And I think I knew that I wasn't going to be a philosopher because, philosophers think like you want to spend a lot of time thinking about like, well,
yeah.
how do we even know the things that we know and how can we even have confidence and do we
Mhm.
really have free will and blah blah blah. And I was like, you know, I can see how we could question all of this, but like I'm just gonna act like I do have free will because I think I'm gonna lose my mind if I
Yeah.
if I
I
start
love it. Yeah, I love a tether to reality a little bit, like a tether
like
to the ground, you know?
something. And like
Yeah.
I already get pretty untethered on my own. So
Yeah.
like I don't need to have a
Yeah.
world that's like there is
Mhm.
no floor, there is no ceiling, there are no
Mhm.
walls. It's like I need some grass at least, like something to put my feet in, you know?
Yeah. But yeah, it's they're gonna make whatever assumptions they make, and so I think it's important that we tell the stories, our stories. Yeah. And you did. You told your story. It was awesome. But
Thank
what
you
do
so
you think? We were in a cult?
much. Um, I think yes. Um, I've always been a little uncomfortable with that word.
Hmm.
Um, Partially because I've heard you and some of the other guests talk about how it's not like we were in a cult where like I had to wear a broom skirt and I couldn't cut my hair and I was going to be pledged to marry someone at the age of 14 and we lived in a compound in
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
Texas or something. Like it wasn't that extreme, but I've heard someone talk about cults as being like high control religious groups.
Hmm.
From that perspective, I'm like, well, yeah, like we
Yeah.
we
Hmm.
we were highly controlled.
Yeah.
So yes, I would say we were.
Well, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your story, all that you've shared with us, for adding your story to this growing conversation. I know it's going to benefit others. So it's rad. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for holding space.
And I'll hold space for anybody who wants to come on and share their story and add to this growing conversation. And as always, if you remember the ICOC or the ICC and you would like to come and share your story, please reach out to me at Clemens with a Z at gmail.com, or you can direct message me at the Clemens with a Z Instagram page. If you'd like to support the podcast, as always, you can rate, review, share the episodes, all that. Also, if you want to support financially, you can go to the GoFundMe that I started for the podcast, and you can follow the link in my bio on Instagram as well. So until next time, guys, peace.